Welcome to the Immigrant Entrepreneurs Show, where our mission is to inspire, impact, and influence other immigrant entrepreneurs to follow their dreams and create the future they want. My guest today is an engineer, an angel investor, serial entrepreneur, and the CEO and founder of Odyssey SpaceWorks. Welcome to the show, Shishir Bankapur.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Ellie. Super excited to
Absolutely.
be here.
So, Shishir, as I told you just off camera before we got on this interview, you put me way out of my comfort zone because the topic we're going to discuss today, or at least you're going to discuss perhaps, is something that I don't have a lot of knowledge about it. And when I was doing research about you, got confronted with a lot of things that I got confronted basically for the first time with. And but as I told you, I like being challenged, and here we are. So Shishir, please give us a idea, our audience, of yourself and your background, and how you got where you are.
Sure. Yeah, let me start with Odyssey, which is the latest thing that I'm, working on. So I founded Odyssey SpaceWorks, and what we do is we build lab satellites for bioscience research in outer space. So we build these, smallish satellites that contain a self-sufficient, biolab, one that you would find in, say, a college, um, or a research institution, that can be remotely controlled from, the ground, giving people greater control over their research. And we built this really um, to take advantage of space, for bettering human lives here on Earth. There's a lot of research that gets done in space, particularly at the ISS. We've had quite a few breakthroughs in understanding how human biology works, how humans age, how cancers form. Um, but the capacity, the lab capacity in space is pretty limited, and it is pretty expensive to get to the ISS and have astronauts do your research. So we decided to build these self-contained lab satellites that effectively enhance access to researchers across the board. I'll give you a quick example of why this is important and why we should take advantage of space conditions to better human lives. So the simplest and easiest thing that allows people to grasp is aging. When you're in space, your body or biological systems age much faster than here on Earth. A simple there's tons of research for a simple heuristic is 4 months in space is the equivalent of aging 10 years here
Wow.
on Earth. So if we can understand what that process looks like, we'll be able to tackle real aging related and longevity related problems that we have here on Earth. An example would be osteoporosis. It takes years and years and years for osteoporosis to develop and become a real problem. But we can accelerate that, and by studying it in an accelerated fashion in space, we're able to introduce some preventions and therapies for it. Similarly with neuromuscular degeneration, like how muscles degrade, how skin, for example, it doesn't all necessarily always have to be medical. It can be cosmetic. Everyone wants to look younger. Everyone wants to live longer. And by understanding how skin ages, maybe we'll be able to develop better cosmetics, things like that. And then there's a whole different section on, uh, you know, studying cancers and cancer formation, uh, growing uh, organs in space. There's a huge, other side to how we can take advantage of space as well. But like at its core is like there's so many benefits that we're only now starting to scratch the surface, and so wanted to be one of the earliest companies that could like help with access to the conditions in a more resource efficient way. um, and yeah, that's basically what Odyssey does. We've launched a satellite already. So our first launch was in November last year. We took two customers on board. The interesting one is we were growing um, animal muscle tissue. So trying to understand, what the effect of space flight is on um, animal muscles, how that relates to both food production in remote areas. Can you just take a few cells and create a burger? And also like understand how neuromuscular degeneration works, in space and things like that. But how I got to all of this was, before this, I spent most of my professional career in startups and software startups. Um, had a few exits. One that I did particularly well on. I was head of engineering for Backstage, which saw almost $1 billion exit, where I did pretty okay. Um, Before that, I ran a AI startup called Clark. We were building LLMs back in 2016, before ChatGPT and everything is out here. But we were doing it for a very specific use case. Um, but before that, I was, again, I just spent most of my time in software, both in London and, here in New York. Um, Before that, I studied chemical engineering in Philly. So my first, real professional experience was in the pharma industry, trying to take whatever we built in labs and, make 10 tons of it. That's basically what chemical engineering is, scaling up, all the research that happens in labs. So, um, yeah, that's a pretty good gist of, you know, where I am, who I am.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And so obviously when I'm listening to you, I'm like, okay, how do you come up with the idea of let's build labs in space? Do you just get up one day and like, okay, that's my new idea, let's get working on it? How do you come up with that?
It's a funny story. So I've always been very interested in space. Ever since I was a kid. There's actually so I grew up in Bombay, uh, and there's actually a photo of me dressed as an astronaut. I think in first grade or second grade, um, for school. It was like a school show and tell. You wear a fancy dress and things like that. So I've always been super interested in space. I took some time after Backstage got acquired to try and think of what does next look like. Um, and so I spent some time in Malibu surfing. And one day, on that trip, I think I was watching Star Trek, or yeah, I think it was Star Trek, where they had to make some medicine to treat something. It was either Star Trek or The Orville. I'm unsure, but you'd imagine that if you're on a spaceship 5,000 years in the future, you hit a button and it just appears, right? Um, Instead, they whipped out two test tubes and they started like playing with test tubes. And at that point, I was like, okay, I don't buy this. Why are they manually doing a lot of this research? You should either like be able to like have some device or something. Um, and so that like really bothered me, where it like sparked this curiosity. It's like, okay, well, what does NASA do right now? Because I know that there's a lot of research that happens at the ISS. And the more I started looking into it, the more it was very clear that it's a very manual process. of there's astronauts and crew at the ISS, being trained 18 months before um, your experiment or your research goes to the ISS, and then 18 months later they manipulate your experiment. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. Um, and so that to me, seemed very inefficient, and it sort of like sparked this interest in me to try and understand, okay, how can we automate this, and how can we give the researchers full control on their investigations, rather than like have this like middleman effectively trying to do whatever they're trying to do. A lot of times they're not trained in that specialization anyway. And so that is really what sparked my curiosity, and it took me about like 4, 5, 6 months to try and speak to a lot of people in the community, and in space, in pharma, the people who are doing the research. And it was very clear that there is a frustration and there is a problem that we could address by automating a lot of it. I mean, the technology is here, why not do it?
I see. And what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is after that you had the initial idea, you went and talked to potential, let's call them customers, future customers, to see if the idea is valid, to even find out if that would be something that there is need for in the market.
Yeah, that's exactly what I did. Went around, spoke to experts effectively, who've done this research before, who have sent stuff to space, who are doing it currently, at Blue Origin or at NASA and everywhere in between. And then also spoke to a lot of healthcare companies, who have an interest in going to space, and understanding what their needs would be, and how we could serve them. So yeah, it was definitely not a, oh, I have this idea, let me build it. It
Mhm.
was validating it with industry experts, and making sure that we were sort of like on the right track.
Mhm. I see. And usually most of businesses that are built, someone has done it before. Let's say you're building I don't know, a commercial building that has these new features that somebody has done it at some point. They have maybe done it differently. But when you're building labs in space, probably no one has done it in the form that you're doing it.
um Not exactly what we're doing, that's for sure. But these labs existed in a sense on the ISS, the International Space Station. And they were very manual. They required astronauts to actually man them. So the components were all there. It wasn't packaged into a fully autonomous or semi-autonomous lab that was free flying on a satellite, or on a satellite that held multiple such labs, where someone on the ground could effectively log into a website, and control their experiment 500 kilometers above their head. So that level of thing didn't exist, but there were a lot of pieces that did. And one of the things that we should credit others is we're the result of a lot of innovation that has already happened, um, and then we learn from that, and then we innovate ourselves. So yeah, in exactly our form factor, it didn't exist before, but uh, you know that doesn't mean that we weren't inspired by like what was happening
Mhm.
around us.
Mhm. I see. And when when I'm listening to you and also observing a little bit, you come across as a very calm and collected person. So when you're building something like this, it comes with so much surprises, I believe, so much unknown, so much, I basically imagine that day-to-day surprises that you cannot foresee. How do you handle this? How do you not get stressed out, and how do you keep going towards your dream and your vision and do what you do without getting discouraged, basically?
Honestly, it's down to the team around us, right? So, I work with a very, very talented team. We had really good support, from industry experts and people who've, worked in space early on. Um, and it's down to like hiring and working with really talented, really smart people that you can trust. And they're full credit to the folks that I work with, where yes, there's a lot of unknown unknowns that come our way, but collectively, I know, and I have this like core belief that there's nothing that's insurmountable. We'll find a way because we have talented scientists and engineers, operators, around us. And what's interesting is the space community. Everyone wants to, you know, do good.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of camaraderie as well, where if we are particularly stuck with something, I'm sure that if I reach out to say a vendor or some of the partners that we work with externally, and ask them for advice, honest, real good advice does filter through. So it's really a credit to that belief in our team, in myself, um, and also the community around us to sort of like solve these problems.
I see. And how do I imagine that? If you have a project like you do, when you get started with the idea, do you have a business plan and then you come up with a pitch that you go and pitch it to your potential new team members and you convince them to join you? How does that work?
Well, how we started was we found a customer. Um, and that was what I was doing was, we hadn't built a team, we hadn't built any tech or, anything. I had this like idea, right? Which was let's build these things, um, and let's have an automated lab with, control on the ground, that you can launch for, fairly cheaply, and and fairly quickly as well. So I started just talking about it to potential customers, potential partners, and someone signed, and they were like, "Okay, great, let's do it." At that point, it became a little real for me. It's like, "Oh
Mhm.
shit, okay, now I have to build a team and build this, and all of that." And so that's when it really started. So um, the challenge, at that point was okay. So we were now pitching the an a real world problem to potential, employees, to potential partners. Is like, hey, we're trying to do this because we have a customer. Can you help us reach that goal? And a lot of very talented engineers and researchers and whoever else, um, enjoy a enjoy solving hard problems, and they came on board. And some I have worked with in the past, and some through the network, we just found talented folks, and yeah, here we are.
Hmm. I love that. So, one burning question that I believe everybody would ask you, or at least our audience would ask you at this point, is how much money does it take to build a company like that?
um Well, it really depends. What we did originally was we raised very, very little amount of money. So I put in some of my own money. We raised some angel capital, and then we had a very small uh, uh, pre-seed round with an established VC, One Way Ventures, who've supported us from the start. Based out of Boston. Um, and so we raised a small amount of money, but we focused it around, let's solve this problem that is at hand, which is, let's have a launch, prove out our concept, and make sure we do it in a very, very efficient manner. So I would say in total, you know what it took for us to launch a satellite, build the satellite, and all of that would be under $500,000.
Wow.
um, so we did it extremely, extremely lean.
Wow.
I didn't pay myself. A lot of people on the team didn't really take real salaries. And only now, we're just closing our seed round, and now is when we start paying people
Mhm.
the of real market salary. um it was hard. There was a lot of, like, we had to make some very crucial decisions based on, like, okay, we don't have that much money, what do we trade off on? But I think the entire team was, like, very excited to solve the problem we had at hand, because it was a challenge. We proved out the concept, we proved that it works. And now we have a customer pipeline that's real. That's some of the biggest names in industry are potential customers, or our customers. So I think the belief that we're creating something new, we're solving a unique problem, and once we prove it out, we know that uh, there's a trajectory for us. So I think that's really how we did it.
I see. So I came across an interview where you say we can reduce the cost of running an experiment from 10 to 20 million dollars to as low as 100K. My question is, how is that possible, Shishir?
Sure. So when we talk about this, like, $10 million number, right? I mean, and that's something that people have paid going to the ISS. Um, it pays for a lot of different things. So if we're talking about, like, going to the ISS, you have sort of like a 18-month qualifying period. There's sort of like a 2-year wait list, at times, to go to the ISS, because you want to make sure that whatever you're taking meets certain criteria, because there are humans in a basically a tin can,
Mhm.
living in space. So you have to make sure that anything that you're taking up there is safe, is secure, won't be hazardous or poisonous, things like that. So there's a lot of time that's spent out there. Additionally, if you look at the cost of, like, crew time, it is an hour of astronauts' time at the ISS is something like $130,000. So that is quite the hourly rate. So if you're looking at all of these things, plus you're looking at, like, launch costs, you have to, like, dock to the ISS. It's all these, like, complex maneuvers that you have to, like, pull off. Plus, as a company, you just have to wait for maybe 2 years. That's a lot of opportunity cost as
Mhm.
well. So there's a lot of complexity that goes in to sending material and prototyping and testing um, on a space station. Now, to NASA's credit, NASA and the U.S. government sponsors a lot of research. So to actual academic researchers, there might not be that much cost, because they'll provide grants. The ISS National Lab will serve all of that. But, like, if you're a private company, trying to go to the ISS, they can always say no. Uh, they have a certain idea of what is safe, and what isn't. They'll uh, it's basically, there is a little bit of a gatekeeping involved, at the ISS. So if you're a private company and you're waiting for 2 years, and then you're paying all of this money and launch and all of that, it does come out to that high number. Now, what we set out to do is, not every company has that money to spare. Like, that's a huge amount, that sort of like restricts who can go to the ISS, to maybe the Mercs of the world, or the Eli Lillys of the world. But everyone has a good idea. Everyone has everyone can have a breakthrough, whether you're sitting in New York or New Delhi or Bangkok. And to make that accessible, how do we do it? So what we did was, let's take a very tried and tested satellite um, frame, which is called a CubeSat format. It effectively is, it's based on the idea that you're building upon, like, uh, cubes as blocks, effectively. So the smallest of the CubeSats can be like 1U, which is a 1 liter box. The largest, um, you know, can be 24U, 24 liters, or more. Um, and so we picked a certain sizing in there, and that's because it is a solved problem. There's a huge market for commercial off the shelf parts. We don't have to like build a custom satellite. In terms of like the frame, the solar panels, all of that, like we can buy that off the shelf, and at and at an efficient rate as well. And what we do is we just focus on the labs. So, let's focus on innovating the labs ourselves. Um, you know, let's stuff our satellites with multiple labs. So we bring the overall cost for each of these labs down. So this is just a hypothetical, right? Like, so if we're sending a 16U, which is a 16-liter satellite, to space, um, we can if we can have, say, 12 labs on that satellite, we're effectively dividing um, the cost between these 12 customers for that launch, for our margins and all of that. So that sort of like uh, reduces the costs. And what we did was we proved that out with our first launch. Is like, yeah, for about 100K, you can
Mm.
have an experiment that runs for 2 months. You can control it from the ground, and go from there. The other big thing is because we're not docking with you know a space station, so there's no need for qualifying for human safety. We don't have to worry about what kinds of materials are going in there. We don't have to worry about um, you know if we take rubber, will it be harmful for crew members if they inhale it, or if there's an electrical fire, things like that. So we can skip a whole bunch of steps, and make it faster and more efficient. And that's where sort of like the 100, 200K number comes in.
I see. And how do you guys operate these labs from wherever you are, or the operator in this case, if it's not you and you guys? Because I also understand you're not owning these labs. You rent it out or let the operator operate it. But how do they do it from here?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We don't do the research. We basically provide the platform and say, here's a lab, do whatever you want to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Or operator or researcher can basically choose in a plug and play fashion. Oh, I want this sensor on here. I want this controller on here. I want this microscope, or I want this imaging. And we can easily, like, just drop in the sensors they want, drop in the imaging, whatever they want, and they can control the temperature, they can control things like humidity, gas composition. They can control the light conditions. They can take images in the visible spectrum, UV, IR. They can do photospectrometry. They can. We're also now working on a new kind of sort of like scanning microscope. We're working on a in orbit sequencer, so we can get DNA sequencing done, all of that. So they can choose all of these things, and how it all effectively works is our company has sort of like we work with a ground station network that is global. So ground station is basically an antenna that communicates with satellites in orbit. Our satellites typically orbit the Earth once every 90 minutes. um, and so by having sort of like this global network of ground stations, every time our satellite is above a ground station, it can exchange information. uh, and what we then can do is, that information which goes from the ground station to our servers, and then we just provide sort of like an API and a portal for our customers, where it's literally as simple as like logging onto a website, and they see all their data there, and then they can like choose to make adjustments. So if they say they see some data and they're like, oh, the temperature is 1 degree too low, they can like adjust that temperature, and then next time our satellite is over one of these ground stations, we send a message to the satellite saying, okay, on lab 2 the temperature needs to be raised by 1 degree Celsius, and it'll do that. So that's typically how it's done.
I see. And usually I imagine if you have a lab, let's say here, physically access to it,
Hmm.
something doesn't work, we go and fix it. Someone goes in there and fix it. How do you do that? If you have a lab in space and something doesn't work, how do you fix it?
If something doesn't work, we cannot fix it manually. And
Hmm.
so, you know, how we prepare for it, and that's really the preparation, right? Like once it's up in orbit, you can't physically touch it.
Right.
How we prepare for it is we have redundancies. That's basically our first step is like, oh, this image sensor failed. Let's use the next one or the one after that. Um, and we have redundancies, and then a big portion of what we have to do is we have to prep and make sure that we've thought of every scenario, program in fail safes, program in what happens when like things fail. For instance, if certain things are failing, can we shut those systems down, use the other systems? Things like that is like a lot of scenario planning, a lot of testing, a lot of um, preparation here on the Earth is really what allows us to be pretty confident in saying, okay, this will work. Even if it doesn't, we have all these backups and things like that. It really is that we just have to test on Earth, we have to prep on Earth, and the rest, is we hope for the best. Things that we absolutely cannot plan for is micrometeorites. If something hits the satellite,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's an act of God, really. Can't really
Mm-hmm.
do anything out there, but we do everything we can to prep on the ground to give our customers and ourselves confidence that everything will work.
I see. Do these customers rent the labs from you guys, or how does that work? How is how is the business model set up?
Yeah. So when we started out, it was a flat fee. So for a flat fee, we do everything. So we get all the regulatory, licenses. We make sure the all the ground testing and ground qualification for actually launching, all of that is done. We make sure we get all the licenses for our customers. We, do all of the material handling for them. Um, and what they get in return is basically, you know they can focus on the science. So they have this lab that they can play with themselves in their labs on the ground, and then use that to like create certain investigations and experiments and things like that. So the thing that I like to constantly talk about is like, if you're asking a chef in a pretty nice restaurant to, make you a meal, you don't expect him to, or you don't expect them to create the knife or the forks.
Mhm.
So what we're doing is we're giving these, scientists and researchers the knives and the forks to create something, pretty unique. So that's literally how it works.
Mhm.
Is we sell them lab space in orbit.
I see. I see. So what is your vision for this project? What is your, if you look a bit further ahead, what do you see and how do you envision this?
Yeah, this is a very good question. There are two big things that, I am thinking about. And the two big things of like how Odyssey should and will evolve. One is there's a lot of talk of private space stations. By 2030, the International Space Station will be uh, coming back or deorbited. It'll be shut down. There are a few space stations that are looking to take its place, and they're private, so private companies. Um, and there's a number of uses for those. How I see Odyssey, working there really is we become, or the Odyssey constellation, which is launching, hundreds of our satellites on a high cadence basis, because um, after the investigate all the investigations on a satellite are done, we usually like burn them up back in the atmosphere. Um, so by launching, say uh, tens or hundreds of satellites, we become this distributed space station all of a sudden. Because if you think about it, the ISS does 200 odd investigations a year on there. We can do that as well. Just by having, say, 20 satellites, we can do 200 investigations on there. So we effectively can free up um, you know manned space stations to do things that you need humans to do, like space exploration, things like that. So by having this like distributed space station, we effectively become a player in science and research and advancing all of that. The other big thing that we see Odyssey contributing to is manufacturing in space. So manufacturing in
Mm.
space is going to be a reality. It's not quite here yet. It will be in the next 5-10 years. um, and there are a number of materials that make more sense to manufacture in space than here on Earth. But how you do it, I'm putting that like chemical engineer hat on, is how you do it is you start with the thing in the lab, the idea of like, okay, this makes sense, I want to manufacture this. You go through iteration, you try and understand how the machinery works, you try and understand how automation works. You try and like create a process so that you can scale that up. And then once you're like at a point where it can scale up, you then like use everything that you've learned, build the machinery the right way, and then manufacture things in space. So in that process, what Odyssey does, and does work very well, is we're working with companies and customers early in the process. So we will help them understand the conditions of space, the manufacturing processes that they might need to take, understand what automation looks like, and help them scale up. Once they're ready to scale up, we then become the machinery that they use to manufacture. So whether they're using, the factory floor, say for example, of Axiom, or any other private space station, um, we effectively become the machinery that they use to manufacture all these things. And I think that's the broader vision is, there will be real estate for manufacturing in space, but we will be the machinery, the high tech machinery that allows people to
Mm.
manufacture things in space.
Does that also include growing food in space? Or is that something
It
you guys are already doing?
it could include, growing food in space. Um, so growing food in space for space missions is definitely a thing. You know, people are growing leafy vegetables and things like that at the ISS currently. What we're still trying to understand is, what does it look like growing food in space and eating that, here on Earth.
Mm.
Uh, I don't know if that is efficient enough just yet, or will ever be. But definitely for if we want to go to the moon or if we want to go to Mars, the idea of growing food in space on the way makes a lot more sense, because then you'll have to send less stuff and it becomes
Mm.
easier to go to Mars, for example. um, However, growing plants in space is a real is a real opportunity for us to understand our planet.
Mm.
And I'll give you an example. So the government of New Zealand, we're working with some researchers from the government of New Zealand to try and understand, can we grow certain types of plant material in space that can capture carbon more efficiently. And if we can figure out a way that we can do that in space and bring those kinds of plants back on Earth, we're effectively solving a small part of the climate crisis, which is capturing carbon and things like that. So I think there's a lot of um, merit to growing plant material in space. Um, but I don't know if that necessarily has to be food to feed, humans on space. Definitely for feeding, humans in space.
Mhm. And I wonder if there is a correlation between we human aging way faster in space and also growing plants in space, that they also grow faster or whatsoever.
Um, I don't know if they grow faster, necessarily, but they grow in more unique ways. So there are subtle differences in how they grow in space, um, you know, as compared to here on Earth. So I think, in that regard, I wouldn't say that if you plant, say, a lettuce, it'll grow like overnight. That's not a thing, because that's not how it works. But it definitely does change, the how it grows in the sense of, there might be structural changes to that lettuce or that flower or whatever it is that grows.
I see. Is there a limit to how many labs you can have in space?
No, it's limited by the number of people who want to do investigations in space. Really,
Mhm.
um, currently, currently on our satellites, um, each satellite, at its max can hold 12 labs. Um, but we can launch multiple satellites at the same time. So really, there's no numerical limit as such.
I see. And I assume there is as many as there must be demand for it, right?
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay. Man, how does your day to day look like? Do you get up and you're like, okay, I'm all in this, and then 12 hours later you're like, I'm still all in on this, or do you do stuff in between? What does it look like?
No, I mean, most of my days now um, is to talk to customers,
Hmm.
is to help them develop programs that can be used for their benefit. So um, a huge pitch to our customers is that you can use the conditions of space to accelerate their commercialization for their
Hmm.
product. So instead of it being, say, it takes them, for example, a drug manufacturer 10 years to release a drug, they can shave like 2 to 3 years off of that by testing things or developing things in space. So most of my day is spent talking to customers, doing sales, things like that, and working alongside my team.
Hmm.
Uh, but when I'm not working, I enjoy my time. That I spend away from work as well.
I see. And I wonder, what decisions do you make, and what decisions do you make, in regard to having your team involved, and you come up with these decisions as a team.
Yeah, I rely on the team um, to effectively advise, because they're experts in their field, right? So they're engineers who have a expertise in that particular field. They're scientists who have expertise in a field. They're operations folks who have expertise in the field. So my role as the CEO really is to surround myself with experts, listen to their recommendations, and then make a decision or make decisions that makes most sense for the business, right? So for a classic case would be like engineers have a particular recommendation which you know may be the most sound engineering decision, but like when it comes to me, I have to look at like what are the trade-offs. What does that have an impact on our sales? What impact does that have on our runway? Things like that. So most of my time is just making decisions based on like if I make this decision, what is the trade-off that we're making, and things like that. A lot of other times, where we work together on is the roadmap. Is like, what are we doing next? What are the innovations that we could be doing? Some come from me, and which is like, hey, we need to be here in a year. We need to be here in 3 years. Um, you know, and I rely on my team to like fill those gaps. Okay, this is our first milestone, this will be the second milestone that we'll need to like get here, and so that's how we collaborate.
I see. I wonder, Shishir, what your relationship is with spirituality, as someone who is very, very technical like yourself. What is your relationship with spirituality?
um that's a very good question. I obviously enjoy yoga, and I meditate. I take time, and you know reflect. um my parents come from two different backgrounds, uh, and so I've been exposed to multiple forms of spirituality and multiple religions, and things like that growing up. So my whole take on spirituality is like, yes, obviously take some time for yourself, try and do the right thing in most of the situations, if not all. um uh, and really just like reflect and have this self-awareness of who you are, what you're doing, and that usually just like helps me. So meditate, between meditation, yoga, and like taking time to reflect, I think that's sort of like the extent of my uh my like practice of spirituality. I recognize there's a lot that I don't know, um and there's a lot that we as humans will never know, at least in our lifetimes. uh, but it shouldn't stop us from trying to understand them, and try and like learn as much as possible from them, whether that be it through scientific inquiry or through looking inward. That's all valid forms, but for me it's trying to be informed of who I am as a person, and trying to like reflect on what I'm doing, and meditate. And I think that's sort of like the extent of
Mm,
my spirituality.
mm. Very beautiful. Thank you. And what is your main driver? What is your core motivation to do what you do in terms of the business and the company you're building?
The core motivation, um, for me at least, is sort of like can be summed into a very simple thing, which is we talk about space a lot, and then we're trying to be spacefarers and live off planet, do all these things. But one of the things that we don't do very well, globally, is to take advantage of space to make life better on Earth. It does, I mean, inadvertently, it does happen. If you do some innovation in communications and radar and all of these things, yes, it sort of like trickles down into everyday, life. But what I am trying to, and my core motivation is use space to understand how life works, use space to understand how biology works,
Mm,
and use that understanding to make life on Earth much, much better. There's a lot of questions that we can answer in terms of like quality of life as people age, cancers, climate change, things like that. We have one Earth right now, and let's try and make people the priority, and make their lives much easier. And I think keeping that in mind is sort of like my motivation of I want to build this, because we have an opportunity to, to leverage the conditions of space to make life on Earth better. And in that process, we all can make some money.
mm, mm. Absolutely. So, Shishir, I think that's a beautiful time and point to wrap up the interview with. I really and truly enjoyed this conversation with you. Before we wrap up, is there anything me, my team, and our audience can do for you?
First of all, thank you so much for the time, and giving me this opportunity to speak with you. I think just follow us, follow what we're doing, and I think that, and like help by following us and encouraging us from far. I think that's like the biggest help that we can get right now.
We will absolutely do that. And of course, we will link you up in the show notes. But where can people find you and follow your journey?
Our site, odysseyspaceworks.com. We're on LinkedIn as well. Yeah, just we're on those two platforms. And then soon we'll have an Instagram channel where we can we'll show all the different things that we're doing. So if people want to get involved, or people want to work with us, yeah, please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for taking the time and coming on.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ali.